Sales at Roskill Information Services. Jessica plans to present a 10-year outlook on titanium metal, laying out anticipated supply and demand trends through 2028. She has been researching minerals and metals for the last 10 years and has a master's degree in geology from the University of Leicester, UK. She joined Roskill in 2012 and has authored numerous reports on titanium and other metals. Please welcome Ms. Jessica Roberts.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and very many thanks to Andy and to the ITA for the invitation to speak to you this morning. So I've got the somewhat daunting task of summarising a report that was 350 pages long into 15 minutes of presentation. Plus, I'm what's standing between you guys and the casino, so I promise I'm going to keep to time. So today I'd like to discuss the various titanium segments we think will be growing or contracting over the next 10 years or so, and putting together some conclusions for what we think this could mean in terms of titanium requirements along the supply chain. So just a quick disclaimer, as I'll make some forward-looking statements, but I'll let you read that at your leisure later on. So a quick overview of my talk today, looking briefly at historical titanium trends, covering sponge, melted product, and mill products. Then I'll have an outlook at the main titanium sectors and give an overview and outlook for titanium supply. I'll cover some potential risks to the market, such as trade tariffs and sanctions, and then finish with a summary. So firstly, how have markets been performing? So this chart is showing output of titanium sponge over the last 20 years, and I won't focus on it too long because Sylvain has already given a great overview of sponge today. But really just to reiterate that the three main suppliers of sponge to the market are China, Japan, and Russia. And note that after 2012, we saw production drop off there because some very high sponge stocks were built up during that previous period. But we understand that stocks are now back down to much more sort of traditional levels for the market. And so we've seen a recovery in sponge production in 2017, and we're also estimating a recovery for 2018. So this chart is showing the flow of titanium sponge from exporter to importer. And the color of it corresponds to the exporting country. So for instance, you can see Russian exports of sponge, they're in red, and they're going essentially all to Europe. The two main things that I want to point out on this slide are the lack of Chinese exports. And really, China has very few exports given the size of its sponge production base. And this is because most Chinese sponge is going to its domestic melters. The other main thing that I wanted to highlight on the slide was this flow of premium grade sponge that you can see going from Japan through to the USA. So it's clear to us, just looking at this chart, that trade routes for sponge, at least, are very consolidated. So looking in further detail at the US markets, again, Ed has already given a great overview of what's happening on the scrap side. But scrap is really crucial for the US market. The US melters, we think, are using around about 50 kilotons of scrap at present, which you can see, that's the blue bar on the chart there. And they're topping that up with around about 35, 40 kilotons of sponge. So really, just to reiterate, that for US melters at least, these guys are very dependent on scrap availability. So in terms of melting capacity, the US and China have by far the largest capacities globally. US melters, they're very focused on producing premium grade melted products that's going into aerospace applications. Whereas China, that's a major producer of melted products, but that's nearly all consumed in the industrial segment. So the world capacities that I've shown here, that does include some triple, double melting capacity. So in terms of the actual available melt capacity, that is, we think, around about 100 kilotons lower than this chart would suggest. So looking again at exports, on the melted side, this chart is showing exports of ingot and slab. And there really isn't that much trade that happens because most melt production is integrated into mill product manufacture. In terms of the major exporters, the US is by far accounting for most of the material in the market in terms of the export situation. And that's really representing export of melt product to subsidiaries that are located in other countries. So, for instance, in France and the UK. Russia is also a pretty considerable exporter of melted products, and that's nearly entirely going to the USA. So on the mill product side, we've seen a very strong recovery since 2017. And both industrial and aerospace segments are performing very well at the moment. Really, the main thing that I want to highlight is the Russian contribution. In terms of exports from Russia, they're very high compared to the country's proportion of the production base. And that's really representing the sort of trade that's happening between VSMPO and the Boeing joint venture and some of its other customers. This chart is showing the split between industrial, aerospace, and medical and consumer markets for titanium mill products. Industrial use, if we look at that, that's on the left. Really what I want to highlight is just that green bar. That represents Chinese consumption of titanium in the industrial segment. On the middle, we've got aerospace. Again, you can see that's pretty clearly dominated by the blue segment, which is the US. We've also got Europe in orange, taking up a large share of that aerospace market as well. Then finally, on the right, that's the sort of medical, consumer, assorted other uses for titanium mill products. And that's split fairly evenly globally, but China, again, is still taking quite a big proportion of that. That's the blue bar. And China is particularly strong in the consumer sectors. So in terms of an outlook, I've polished my crystal ball. What does it indicate for the next decade? So before I review our forecasts, I just want to talk through this graphic. This chart is showing the flow of titanium units through the supply chain, all the way from mining through to the sort of final end user. The thickness of the lines represents the volume of contained titanium. So really just to point out the large volumes of revert that are generated in the titanium metal supply chain. So you can see in light blue, that's your sort of semi-finished mill product stage. That's flowing into the individual mill product uses, so aerospace and industrial and so on. And at the point where you've got the green mill product stage, there's a huge amount of revert that's coming off of that. So, as I'm sure we're all aware, aerospace companies are very keen to reduce the amount of scrap that's generated in terms of their buy-to-fly ratios. And that's a key focus of our analysis. So in terms of a mill product outlook, firstly looking at civilian aerospace, jet engine demand and airframer demand is growing very well. Order backlogs from the two main airframe producers represents about 9 years of a production backlog at the moment. General aviation, that hasn't been performing as well in recent years. That had quite a big downturn after the economic collapse in 2008, and it's still not really back up to those levels yet. In terms of other civilian aerospace uses, on the helicopter side, That's been affected by a drop in oil and gas prices in 2015. A lot of civilian helicopters are serving those platforms. But Honeywell is a major producer, and they are expecting a good recovery over the next 5 years or so. On the military side, this is also growing very strongly, although it can be trickier to sort of get hold of indicators for that market for obvious reasons. But for fighter jets on the F-35, we forecast over 1,500 of those to be delivered between 2018 and 2028. Chinese and Russian fighter jet deliveries, we're also expecting those to grow very well based on the sort of contract information that has been available to us so far. Military helicopters, they're generally using much less titanium than fixed-wing aircraft, but overall unit deliveries of those are forecast to increase too quite strongly, so this is going to be beneficial for titanium use as well. In non-aerospace markets, I'd say the outlook is really very generally positive. For industrial uses, we see most opportunity in the power segment and specifically on the nuclear turbine blade market. In terms of oil and gas, titanium contraction is probably going to happen towards the middle of this outlook period, kind of early 2020s or so, as we're forecasting a drop in oil and gas prices, and coinciding with that, drilling activity typically drops off during low prices. Automotive titanium, now that's quite an interesting market. That has the potential to grow hugely if fuel cell vehicles grow as I think the Japanese government would like them to. I think there are some questions over whether fuel cell vehicles are really going to be competitive or not compared to electric vehicles. But over time, this could play out as quite a significant market for titanium. And there's also titanium that's being used in certain EV models as well, such as certain Teslas. Looking at medical and consumer, orthopedic titanium use, that's growing very strongly. People are getting older, people need replacements for various joints and so on, so this is all beneficial for titanium use. Likewise, there's some legislation in Europe at the moment regarding the use of cobalt in medical applications, and if that turns out to be a negative for cobalt, then this could be quite good for titanium. So the end-use markets, in general, they're looking very positive. But in aerospace, we do think that titanium demand is going to track below the growth that's happening in the overall sector itself. Basically, that's because we're seeing greater use of near-net shape production techniques for certain complex parts in aerospace. So things like, obviously, additive manufacturing, 3D printing, but also on the investment casting side, extruding, and so on. So in terms of modeling what we think that impact could be from the near-net shape production techniques, this chart is showing two scenarios for overall outlook for titanium use in aerospace. So if you look at the blue line, that's forecast use of titanium in aerospace, which is assuming that the buy-to-fly ratio falls from around about 5.5 to 1 at present to moving closer to sort of 4 to 1 over the next 10 years or so. Then if you look at the green line, that's forecast titanium use in aerospace, assuming that the buy-to-fly ratio remains broadly stable. So just to illustrate what that difference equates to in terms of titanium demand, that's around a 20 kiloton difference by 2028. So looking now onto our sort of supply outlook, on a sponge and melt basis, this has been quite stable, and the main changes that we've seen have been that new sponge plant starting up in Saudi Arabia, the joint venture with Toho. I understand that that's still taking time to ramp up, but they did have their first batch production and distillation in August. In terms of melt capacity, Perryman is expanding in Pennsylvania, and that expansion is due online in 2019. By that point, they're expecting to have capacity of around about 12 kilotons per year. Looking at a forecast, there are two potential scenarios that we see depending on how the bite-to-fly ratio reductions turn out. Now, they may not be an issue, but I think combined with sort of certain geopolitical considerations at the moment, they could potentially become quite important considerations for the market. So firstly, on one hand, I think if near-net shape production routes do grow as we're forecasting, then the generation of revert and therefore the availability of scrap for remelting is going to fall. And now this could be an issue particularly for the US melters who are using a lot of scrap in their melt production. On the other hand, if bite-to-fly ratios remain broadly similar, then premium melt capacity could be the thing that's actually more of an issue for the supply chain. We understand that melt utilization is quite high at the moment, and I think that's even more so for premium grade melters. As we've talked about over the last couple of days at this conference, Boeing and Airbus, they've got some very aggressive ramp-up strategies and ramp-up targets over the next few years. So melt capacity could be the thing that causes a bit of an interruption to that. On the supply chain, just to highlight some of the main risks that we're considering at the moment, they're basically around government policies. Russian sanctions, they haven't really touched titanium so far, and we suspect they're unlikely to, just because of the importance of that Boeing and VSMPO joint venture. But it is a risk, so it's something that we're going to keep an eye on. I think Brexit, which is Britain exiting the European Union, that could become an issue for companies that are based in or trading with the UK. And that's particularly the case if we get to this sort of doomsday scenario of a no-deal Brexit, in which case we'd revert to sort of WTO tariffs and taxes. And then finally, just looking at the US-China trade tariff situation. At the moment, we're not expecting it to impact titanium that much, just because there isn't a huge amount of trade between the two countries. But this could affect aerospace companies later on if the retaliation does continue. So just to conclude, to wrap that all up, our base case forecast at the moment is for an overall 2% per year increase in titanium demand out to 2028. We see, in terms of the sectors that are growing very well, industrial, consumer, medical markets, these all look very promising at the moment. Aerospace, in terms of the volume of planes going to be delivered, we think this is very promising, but the growth of titanium may well track slightly below that because of this improvement in bite-to-fly ratios and the potential reduction in titanium demand that could bring. On the supply side, there are potentially some bottlenecks. I don't think there are too many challenges at the moment, but they could be worsened by what's happening just with the global political situation. So we'll keep an eye on all of that. We'll update our forecasts. But our position at the moment is that the outlook for titanium is pretty strong, and we're optimistic for the future market. So just a cheeky plug. We did publish a new titanium metal report back in August, so if you have any questions about that, please speak to me now or drop me a line later on. But thank you very much for your attention.